Arthur had once been a merciless king who ruled the world through overwhelming power. During his rise to dominance, he annihilated generals, reduced entire cities to ashes with nuclear fire, and committed countless atrocities in his pursuit of control. However, one day he found himself reflecting on the terrible acts he had carried out. A deep sense of guilt began to consume him, and soon after, he succumbed to a mysterious illness. As he slowly drifted into darkness, he heard a voice echoing through the void. The voice offered him a second chance and warned him not to waste it this time. Moments later, Arthur opened his eyes and saw two people looking down at him. The man was Reynold, who was apparently his father, and the woman beside him was Alice, his mother. Although they did not expect their newborn child to understand their words, they joyfully welcomed him into the world. Gradually, Arthur realized that these two people were indeed his parents, and that he had been born only moments ago. He struggled to comprehend the fact that he had somehow been reborn as a baby. Still, he could not ignore how naturally caring and nurturing his parents were. For the most part, he felt content, though he was far from thrilled about being trapped in an infant's body. His head felt oversized, he could not speak, and every few hours he soiled his diaper without any control. In short, he had completely lost his autonomy. Then something caught his attention, something even stranger than his current situation. He watched as his father channeled energy into his fists and shattered a massive boulder into pieces. Arthur was left in awe, as this was a power completely unfamiliar to him, even after spending years ruling the world. The display appeared to be quite impressive, and Reynold seemed proud of himself. He turned toward his family, expecting praise. However, Reynold failed to remain aware of his surroundings, and a loose rock suddenly fell onto his head. Alice, having anticipated that something like this might happen, rushed over and began healing the injury with magic. At the same time, she scolded him and warned him to be more careful the next time he decided to show off. Although Reynold had only been flexing his strength earlier, his fists were not something to underestimate when he was serious. During hunts, he could take down a wild boar with a single blow. Having him in a hunting party made things significantly easier for everyone involved. Once the hunt ended, Reynold headed home, eager to receive a warm welcome hug from his family. However, he soon remembered that he was still drenched in boar blood. Clearly, a quick wash would have to come first. From everything he had witnessed, Arthur deduced two important things. First, this world was dangerous enough that people commonly carried weapons for protection. Second, if he wanted to live freely here, he would need to learn how to fight. After Reynold returned home, Alice said it was time to put Arthur down for a nap. Normally, Arthur would have been annoyed at being treated like a baby. Surprisingly, however, this was something he genuinely enjoyed. In his previous life, peaceful sleep had been a rare luxury. Assassins constantly attempted to kill him whenever he let his guard down. While he was capable of handling any attackers, the constant threat had been incredibly stressful. As the months passed, Arthur's infant body gradually grew stronger, eventually allowing him to move on his own. The first thing he did with this newfound freedom was waddle over to a mirror and stare intently at his reflection. His parents found it adorable, assuming he was fascinated by his own image. In reality, Arthur was struggling to accept the truth. He had truly been reborn as a helpless baby. Now that he could move freely, Arthur wasted no time putting his plan into action. Later that day, when Alice laid him down for a nap, he waited until she left the room. The moment she stepped away, he opened his eyes, tossed aside his blanket, and carefully climbed down from the crib. Meanwhile, Alice was busy washing dishes and remained completely unaware as Arthur crawled across the floor. Slowly but steadily, he made his way to the other side of the room without being noticed. She must have been extremely focused on those dishes. When he finally reached his destination, Arthur opened the door to the house's library and grabbed a book. He needed to start learning about this new world. After reading through one of the books, he discovered that the continent he was on was called Dikathon. It was divided into three kingdoms: the Darv Kingdom, a subterranean nation inhabited by dwarves; the Elenor Kingdom, home to elves who live deep within vast forests; and the Sapin Kingdom, a human nation ruled by a king. Although no one in this world seemed to rely on nuclear warfare to gain power, Arthur remained eager to learn more. He picked up another book, which finally provided the answers he had been searching for. Arthur soon realized that the technological development of this world was relatively primitive. The reason for this was the existence of magic. People in this world could use magic by channeling the mana within their bodies. Although not everyone possessed this ability, magic still played a crucial role in daily life. There were two primary ways individuals could utilize magic: augmentation and conjuring. Augmenters circulated mana throughout their bodies, granting themselves immense strength, increased durability, and enhanced agility. Conjurers, on the other hand, could project mana outside their bodies to manipulate and control various phenomena. However, Arthur could not find any mention of the healing magic that Alice had used earlier. This led him to believe that her abilities might be quite rare. Based on what he read, most people began to manifest mana once they reached puberty. By channeling this energy through something known as a mana core, they could learn to control it and eventually become mages. Arthur found this concept easy to understand. In his previous life, he had risen to power by harnessing a natural energy known as ki. It functioned in almost exactly the same way as mana. With this in mind, he concentrated intensely, attempting to trigger a similar response within himself. As expected, a mana core began to form. This was a major step forward in his development. Before he could continue his training, however, his mother finally found him. She had been extremely worried after discovering that he was no longer in his crib, so she felt immense relief when she saw that he was safe. As she picked him up, she suddenly noticed something unusual about him. Arthur immediately began to worry that she might have sensed the mana within him. Fortunately, that was not the case. She had simply realized that he had soiled himself yet again. 2 years passed. One day, Alice sat writing in her journal. She expressed how grateful she felt that Arthur was growing up strong and healthy. However, she also admitted that she was beginning to worry. Since the day he was born, she had never once seen Arthur smile. At that moment, she glanced outside and noticed Reynold and Arthur together. It appeared that Reynold was teaching him some basic swordplay. Arthur looked genuinely interested in the lesson, but Alice was furious that Reynold would allow a 2-year-old to wield something as dangerous as a stick. By now, Arthur had learned that angering Alice was not a good idea. To avoid getting into trouble, he decided he would need to be more careful about participating in dangerous activities. Later, Alice decided to take Arthur out for the day to show him around the town. Arthur was particularly excited about this, as it would allow him to gather valuable information about the world. While exploring, he was able to estimate the technological level of the nation simply by examining the weapons being sold to ordinary citizens. The most exciting moment came when he witnessed a mage casting fire magic right in front of him. From Arthur's perspective, the trip had been incredibly valuable. By the end of the day, however, Arthur's small body was completely exhausted from all the activity. He struggled to stay awake, while Alice looked forward to putting him down for a nap as soon as they returned home. Despite the limitations of his new life, Arthur had begun to appreciate the warmth of having loving parents. In his previous life, he had started with nothing. Abandoned at birth and raised in an orphanage, he had never experienced parental love. Compared to that lonely past, this new life felt like a welcome change. Arthur soon dozed off on Alice's shoulder, and she began carrying him to his crib. Along the way, she softly told him how proud she was of everything he had learned, and that she had seen the excitement in his eyes when he first experienced the outside world. Because of this, she believed he possessed a strong sense of adventure. Alice assumed he had inherited that spirit from Reynold. She knew that sooner or later Arthur would want to leave home and explore the world on his own. Although she personally hoped he would live a quiet and peaceful life with them, she was willing to support whatever path he chose, as long as he was truly happy. The next day, Arthur stood by the window and watched as his father began practicing in the front yard. Curious to see the practical use of magic up close once again, he observed eagerly as Reynold circulated mana throughout his body. Eventually, several rocks began to rise from the ground. Reynold acted as though the feat was incredibly impressive, but Arthur quietly judged it to be rather underwhelming. In truth, this was the limit of Reynold's conjuring abilities. However, that was only because his true strength lay in augmentation, which made his magic far more effective when used internally to enhance his own body. Even so, watching his father demonstrate magic inspired Arthur to train as well. Just as he prepared to climb down from the table to begin practicing, Alice interrupted and informed him that it was time for his nap. Arthur still could not speak, so as they passed the bookshelf, he began whining in protest. Alice firmly reminded him that it was nap time and that there would be no books for now. Normally, Arthur would have had no chance of winning such an argument. However, he had recently discovered a powerful technique, the pout. By skillfully using his baby-like cuteness, he had turned it into a surprisingly effective weapon. Although Alice still intended to put him down for a nap, she eventually gave in and allowed him to read his book instead. Once he was alone, Arthur began training with his mana. Over the past 2 years, he had become remarkably skilled at controlling it. By gathering small fragments of mana throughout his body, he had successfully formed a mana core within himself. The process had been exhausting, but the results made it worthwhile. Now, with just a little more focus, he believed he could cast his very first spell. Unfortunately, Arthur misjudged the strength of his mana and accidentally triggered a massive explosion that destroyed the entire house. At the time of the blast, his parents were outside. The explosion was so powerful that Reynold's back was severely burned. Aside from that injury, however, both he and Alice were safe. It did not take them long to realize that Arthur had been inside the house when it happened. Panicked, they rushed into the ruins to see if he had survived. An explosion of that magnitude should have made survival impossible for a baby. Yet, when Reynold reached the library, he was stunned to discover that Arthur was not only alive but completely unharmed. And even more astonishingly, he appeared to be the one responsible for the explosion. Arthur was only 3 years old. Under normal circumstances, people did not begin using magic until they were at least 12. Yet Arthur already demonstrated extraordinary control over mana. Standing proudly, Arthur looked toward his parents. Unfortunately, he completely forgot that the house around him was still collapsing. Suddenly, 2 heavy roof beams came crashing down toward him. He tried to run, but his tiny legs gave out beneath him, making it seem as though his life was about to end. Luckily, both Alice and Reynold rushed in at that very moment. Alice threw herself over Arthur, shielding him with her body, while Reynold used his magic to halt the falling debris and protect them both. Arthur was stunned. It was the first time anyone had ever risked their life to save him. Alice, overwhelmed with relief that he was safe, burst into tears. Arthur was still not used to having people care about him so deeply. Seeing her cry caused something inside him to break, and he began crying as well. In his previous life, he could never have allowed himself such vulnerability. As king, he had been expected to remain cold and merciless at all times. He remembered one particular incident from that life. A man had once attempted to assassinate him. After the man was captured, the royal council gathered to pass judgment. They had not only planned to execute the assassin, but also to send his wife and son back to their homeland, a punishment that would have condemned them to torture and experimentation. The man had begged Arthur to spare his family, insisting that they were innocent and should not suffer for his actions. In the end, Arthur showed what little mercy he could by executing the man immediately. That was simply how things had been during his reign. Now, however, life was very different. These days, Arthur spent his time training with his father. During one training session, Reynolds suggested that Arthur try using gauntlets instead of a sword. Arthur refused. Having spent his entire previous life mastering the sword, he had no intention of abandoning it as his primary weapon. Seeing how determined Arthur was, Reynolds decided to use a sword himself. To make the duel more interesting, he enhanced the blade with mana. To his astonishment, Arthur did the same, and effortlessly sliced straight through Reynolds' mana-infused sword. After witnessing this, Reynolds realized that Arthur's talent far exceeded his own ability to train him. He began considering the possibility of finding a professional instructor and went inside to discuss the matter with Alice. Alice immediately rejected the idea. She insisted that there was no way she would send Arthur to some distant town just for training. They had already agreed that Reynolds would teach him combat while she would guide his magical education. However, Reynolds explained that Arthur had just cut cleanly through his mana-infused sword. If Arthur could accomplish something like that at such a young age, then his future potential was unimaginable. Reynolds argued that such talent required proper guidance from a skilled mentor. Although Alice could not deny Arthur's extraordinary abilities, she still hated the thought of sending him away to a school in the city all by himself. Unable to reach an agreement, she and Reynolds began arguing about it. After listening to them bicker for several minutes, Arthur finally grew tired of the debate. He interrupted by suggesting a simple solution. They could all move to the city together. That way he could receive proper training without being separated from his parents. The idea had never occurred to them before, but it solved the problem perfectly. Both Alice and Reynolds quickly agreed, and they immediately began preparing for the journey. The following day, a carriage arrived to take them to the city. They would be traveling alongside several of Reynolds and Alice's old friends. Arthur recognized them immediately as the group who had helped rebuild the house after he had accidentally destroyed it. They were all members of an adventuring party known as the Twin Horns. The group's leader, Adam, stepped forward first and introduced himself to Arthur. Next came Angela, who enthusiastically introduced herself before pulling Arthur into a tight embrace that nearly suffocated him. His mother watched the scene unfold with a cheerful smile. Fortunately, just before Arthur lost consciousness, Durden stepped in and pulled him away from Angela. He calmly introduced himself and gave Arthur a friendly high five. Arthur then noticed a girl standing quietly on top of the carriage. She did not speak, so the others explained that her name was Jasmine. Finally, the last member of the group introduced herself as Helen, the party's archer. With the introductions finished, the group prepared to depart. Everyone climbed into the carriages and the journey began. During the ride, Alice turned to Arthur and asked whether he was excited about his very first major trip. Arthur replied that he was excited about the journey, but internally he could not help reflecting on how primitive this world seemed. People relied on horse-drawn carts for travel, whereas in his previous life he had commanded an entire fleet of flying ships. After spending most of the day on the road, the group eventually stopped to rest and eat, setting up a temporary camp. However, the moment they halted, a pack of wolves launched a sudden attack. The beasts charged recklessly, but the experienced adventurers quickly overpowered them and dispatched them within moments. Arthur found the scene fascinating, as it was the first time he had witnessed real combat in this world. Watching the battle strengthened his resolve. One day, he intended to become strong enough to handle threats like that on his own. Since they now had several wolf carcasses, the group decided to cook the meat for dinner. Unfortunately, they had no spices, meaning the meal would simply be plain grilled meat. Around that time, Alice noticed a small injury on Reynolds' arm and offered to heal it. Before she could begin, Jasmine quickly told her to wait. The others immediately gathered around to keep watch. Healers with Alice's abilities were extremely rare, and if anyone saw her using healing magic, she could easily become a target. Once Reynolds' wound had been fully healed, the group returned to their usual activities. Adam, however, felt like stretching his limbs before going to sleep. Having heard many stories about Arthur's unusual strength, he said he wanted to see it for himself. The sparring match was meant to be nothing more than a friendly test of skill. Adam instructed Arthur to prepare himself while channeling mana into his spear. Without hesitation, Arthur did the same with his own weapon. As soon as the match began, Arthur focused magic into his feet. Just as he rushed toward Adam, he suddenly vanished and reappeared behind him. It should have been the perfect opportunity to strike, but his short, clumsy toddler legs betrayed him. His feet slipped against the ground, throwing him off balance. The stumble gave Adam just enough time to recover. The two continued sparring, but Arthur's small body could not match the strength of an experienced adventurer. Eventually, Adam struck him hard enough to send him flying into the air. Fortunately, the others caught him before he hit the ground. They immediately scolded Adam for nearly injuring Arthur, but Adam defended himself, explaining that he had been unable to hold back because Arthur was far too strong. He remarked that it was unbelievable for a child to possess such power, and speculated that Reynold must have subjected him to some kind of elite training. In reality, Reynold had never taught Arthur any of it. Arthur had developed those abilities entirely on his own. At that moment, Jasmine approached and accidentally startled Arthur. She admitted that she had been very impressed by his performance and asked if he could teach her the technique he used with the magic in his feet. Arthur had originally hoped to keep that technique to himself, since it was something he had perfected in his previous life. However, Jasmine clearly had no intention of accepting refusal. Judging by the determined look in her eyes, Arthur suspected she would keep bothering him until he agreed. Eventually, he realized he might have no choice but to teach her. The following morning, the journey resumed. Along the way, the group took several breaks to rest. During one of these stops, Adam gave Arthur some basic lessons in spear combat, while Helen showed him how to use a bow shortly afterward. With just a few instructions, Arthur quickly began to grasp the fundamentals. Since his expertise from his previous life was limited to swordsmanship, these new lessons proved extremely valuable. Appreciating how much he was learning from the others, Arthur eventually decided to share his speed technique with Jasmine. The method involved channeling mana into the feet while simultaneously using wind magic, creating a dramatic boost in speed. After watching Arthur perform it once, Jasmine managed to replicate the technique almost perfectly. Later, while Arthur was reading a book about magic inside the carriage, he noticed that Jasmine was nearby, quietly staring at him. It was obvious that this was not a coincidence. She seemed to take every opportunity to stay close to him. The next morning, Jasmine gave Arthur a knife as a token of gratitude for teaching her the technique. It soon became clear that she might have feelings for him, especially since she rarely made an effort to connect with others. A short while later, everyone climbed back into the carriages and continued their journey. As Arthur sat reading his book, the caravan was suddenly ambushed by bandits. The attackers quickly surrounded the carriage, leaving no route for escape. The bandit leader ordered his men to seize the women and children so they could be sold into slavery. At once, the bandits charged forward, and the adventurers fought desperately to hold them back. Individually, the members of the Twin Horns and Reynold were far stronger than the bandits, but the overwhelming numbers made the situation extremely dangerous. Eventually, the bandit leader managed to hurl Reynold violently into the carriage, leaving him badly injured. Alice instinctively tried to rush forward to heal him, but Reynold warned her to stay back. If the bandits discovered her healing abilities, she would immediately become their next target. Instead, Reynold urged Arthur to take Alice and escape as quickly as possible. Arthur hesitated, unwilling to abandon his father, but Reynold insisted. He revealed that Alice was pregnant with Arthur's younger brother, and that protecting her had to come first. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Arthur finally agreed. Once Reynold gave the signal, Arthur prepared his magic and readied himself to flee with Alice. Meanwhile, Reynold vowed to stay behind and stall the bandits. The bandit leader ordered his men to pursue Arthur and Alice, but Reynold refused to allow it. He charged forward and clashed with the leader. Although the bandit had previously knocked him down, Reynold now fought with renewed determination, knowing his family's safety depended on him. As Reynold kept the bandit leader occupied, several other bandits attempted to chase Arthur and Alice. However, Adam and Jasmine quickly threw daggers, taking down the pursuers and creating an opening for Arthur to escape. Everyone did their best to hold the bandits back while Arthur focused entirely on getting his mother out of danger. Arthur could not help but find the situation ironic. In his previous life, he had taken whatever he wanted without caring about anyone else. Now, he was running for his life simply to protect someone he loved. After several minutes of running, Arthur believed they had placed enough distance between themselves and the bandits. Unfortunately, he was wrong. From a cliff above, a bandit had been observing them. Unlike the others, this one could use magic. The bandit cast a powerful wind spell directly at them. Arthur did not notice him immediately, and by the time he did, the attack was already on its way. The only thing Arthur could do was shove Alice aside and take the full force of the spell himself. The blast struck him violently and sent him flying backward toward the edge of the cliff. With his fragile toddler body, the fall would almost certainly mean death. However, if he was going to die, he refused to go alone. As he fell, Arthur pulled out the knife Jasmine had given him and threw it toward the bandit. The blade struck its target, and the attached string wrapped tightly around the bandit's ankle. Arthur used the momentum to yank him off the cliff as well. The adventurers quickly attempted to use magic to catch Arthur, but he had already fallen too far for them to reach. It seemed inevitable. Arthur was doomed. As he plummeted toward the ground, Arthur reflected on his life. Even though death seemed certain, he felt an unexpected sense of peace. He had managed to protect the family that meant so much to him. At that moment, he finally understood why the assassin from his past life had begged him to spare his family. Arthur himself had not hesitated to sacrifice everything to protect his mother. Although he did not regret his decision, a small part of him wished he could have spent just a little more time with them. Miraculously, after the fall, Arthur somehow managed to crawl out of the river and stumble into a nearby cave. However, the moment he entered, he found himself staring directly into the eyes of a terrifying creature. Instantly regretting his decision to seek shelter there, Arthur attempted a surprise attack. The creature effortlessly swatted him aside in midair, then calmly told him to relax. The creature insisted that it was not evil and claimed it only wanted to be friends. Arthur, however, did not believe a single word of it. Regardless of the creature's intentions, Arthur was still badly injured, and his wounds would not heal unless he ate something. At that moment, the creature began picking strange fruits that grew along the cave walls and told Arthur to eat them. Arthur hesitated. He did not trust random fruits growing out of a wall inside a cave. He tried to stand up so he could talk his way out of the situation, but his injuries finally caught up with him. As he attempted to rise, he heard something snap and immediately broke down in tears. The creature scolded him and told him to stop crying. After all, surviving that fall had already been a miracle. Arthur's mind filled with questions, but the creature refused to answer any of them until he ate the fruit. Reluctantly, Arthur took a bite of one of the berries. To his surprise, it tasted delicious. Once he had finished eating, Arthur asked the creature if it knew anything about what had happened to his parents. The creature explained that it could not leave the cave, so it was unable to check on them directly. However, it possessed an ability that allowed it to see across great distances. Using that power, it created a glowing screen and showed Arthur that his parents and the others had defeated the remaining bandits. They were alive and safe. Arthur felt immense relief and thanked the creature for confirming that his family had survived. Realizing he would likely be stuck in the cave for some time, he decided it would be best to get along with his unusual companion. Her name, he learned, was Sylvia, and despite her frightening appearance, she turned out to be quite kind. Over the next several days, Arthur remained in the cave, eating and resting while his injuries slowly healed. Sylvia stayed nearby the entire time, watching over him closely. Once he had regained his strength, Arthur immediately wanted to return home. Sylvia warned him that attempting the journey alone would be suicide. The cave was located on the outskirts of the Elven Forest, an area filled with dangerous magical beasts and ruthless bandits, far more than Arthur could handle. However, Sylvia explained that he would not be trapped there forever. She possessed the ability to open a dimensional rift, which meant she could eventually send him somewhere safer, possibly even back home. The problem was that creating such a rift required a great deal of time and energy. Until then, Arthur would simply have to wait. With nothing else to do, Arthur grabbed a stick and practiced his swordsmanship. Several more days passed. Although Arthur had grown to appreciate Sylvia's company, he still knew almost nothing about her. All he understood was that she resembled a terrifying monster, that she seemed to be hiding from something, and that she possessed an unexpectedly gentle nature. One day, after finishing his sword practice, Arthur sat down on a nearby rock and began training his mana. Sylvia watched with interest and remarked that it was impressive for someone so young to already possess a mana core. However, she suspected that Arthur had never learned a certain advanced technique. She extended her hand, and a large amount of mana began gathering in her palm. Arthur was stunned. Sylvia was collecting mana from the environment itself, while casting her spell. If he could learn to do the same, he realized he would become far more powerful than he already was. Before offering to teach him, Sylvia asked Arthur a question. What did he intend to do with the power he would gain? Arthur had never thought deeply about that before. After reflecting for a moment, he remembered how his family and friends had nearly been killed by bandits. With that in mind, he declared that he would use his strength to destroy anyone who dared to harm his loved ones. Sylvia did not like that answer. She flicked Arthur sharply on the forehead, knocking him backward. She then told him firmly that she would never share her techniques with someone who thought that way. Arthur argued that wanting to destroy one's enemies was only natural. He could not understand why Sylvia was so angry. To make her point, Sylvia gently pressed a single finger against Arthur's forehead. She explained that with that same touch she could either crush his skull instantly or lightly brush his skin. Then she asked which outcome he would prefer. Arthur immediately replied that he would prefer the gentle touch. Sylvia explained that acting out of anger and hatred was easy, but once someone allowed those emotions to control them, their life would become an endless cycle of resentment. She did not want Arthur to waste his life that way. She asked him once again what he planned to do with his power. This time, Arthur paused and reflected more carefully. His thoughts drifted to the smiling faces of the people he cared about most. With that image in mind, he answered that he wanted to use his strength to protect those dear to him. Sylvia smiled, clearly pleased with that response. Meanwhile, outside the cave, a creature that looked very similar to Sylvia had begun tracking her. It was dangerously close to finding her location. And that was part 1. Hope you enjoyed and subscribe to not miss the next part and watch the next video on screen.